We now cross over to our Oseong for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Mark. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. A UN expert called on the South Korean government to take a consistent approach to human rights in North Korea. Wrapping up his trip to Seoul, Thomas Quintana, UN Special Rapporteur on North Korea human rights on Wednesday, highlighted the urgent need to address the ongoing abuses and violations of the basic freedoms, rights and necessities of people living under the Kim Jong-un regime. With engagement between the two Koreas and between the US and North Korea having stalled since 2018, efforts to push for progress on human rights in the North has been ever more difficult. Today, we speak with a scholar, journalist and activist who has been working tirelessly to expose and mitigate the human rights situation in North Korea. Greg Scarlatoiu is the Executive Director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, also known as HRNK in short. He is also a visiting professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, and for the past 19 years, he has authored and broadcast the Korean language Scarlatoiu column for Radio Free Asia. Very warm welcome to you, Director. Thank you so much for joining us today.
A very good morning to you. Thank you very much. I'm honored.
It's our honor to have you on our program. And, firstly, from restricting the freedom of speech, movement and religion in daily life to arbitrary detainment, execution, forced labor and prison camps, human rights in North Korea are described as rampant and systematic. And, last December marked the 10th year since leader Kim Jong-un came to power. In your view, has the human rights situation in the North got better or worse over that time?
A February 2014 report by a UN Commission of Inquiry found that crimes against humanity were being committed in North Korea. Regrettably, the human rights situation has not improved under Kim Jong-un. Quite the contrary. The human rights situation has deteriorated. These developments include crackdown on border crossing, crackdown on information coming in from the outside world, crackdowns on the markets that have truly acted as survival mechanisms for the people of North Korea. And these developments have truly amplified under COVID, under the pretext of COVID for the past 2 years.
And one of the big focus areas for HRNK has been exposing North Korea's brutal concentration camps where tens of thousands of people are believed to be held even now. And, who are typically held there, and what is life like for inmates of one of those camps?
One has to remember that there are multiple types of detention facilities. There are up to 120,000 political prisoners being held at Gwaliso political prison camp, men, women, and children, imprisoned pursuant to a system of guilt by association called Yonjaje. They're subjected to a relentless, vicious cycle involving induced malnutrition and forced labor. Many of them simply waste away. Grave violations are happening in North Korea's Gyohwaso, re-education through labor camps, as well as short-term detention facilities. So basically, you're talking starvation, torture, executions, and a very, very severe lack of food.
And you recently wrote a piece in Foreign Policy on how North Koreans face human rights abuses when they leave their borders, as well as within their borders, as they escape to countries like China. And you also described how Chinese companies, they've been evading UN sanctions on North Korea, which enables more human rights abuses under the regime. How has the United States been addressing these kind of issues, and what further efforts would you like to see from the global community?
It would be extraordinarily important to persuade China to cease and desist its policy of forcibly repatriating North Korean refugees to North Korea. China is a party to the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and its 1967 additional protocol. The standard applied here is that a refugee should not be returned to a place where she or he faces a credible fear of persecution. We have thoroughly documented that North Koreans return to North Korea from China, remember, most of them are women, 70 to 80%, they have been subjected to extraordinarily cruel treatment, harsh interrogations, beatings, torture, imprisonment, and even executions. That's one big change that we could see there. Also, China continues to import North Korean minerals, North Korean coal. I'm not going to touch upon the UN Security Council resolutions that ban such importation based on a political security rationale, funds that go to North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. I will go to the human rights argument. The North Korean mineral and coal supply chain is tainted by the use of forced labor. Many detention facilities, including political prison camps, are located next to North Korean mines, and prisoners are forced to work in these mines under very harsh conditions.
And well, the United States imposed the sanctions against North Korea over its human rights abuses. In what ways has pressure worked? Has it actually improved human rights in North Korea?
It is very important to remind the despots of the world, especially those who refuse to abide by the rules of the international order, in particular human rights treaties and international human rights norms, that we know very well what is going on. And there will be a price to pay for oppressing and exploiting their own people at home and abroad. And this is one very important message, that the sanctions, U.S. sanctions based on a human rights rationale as well, send to the North Korean regime. Has there been improvement on the human rights front in North Korea? Arguably in some areas, for example, disability. Mrs. Aguilar, the UN special representative for the rights of people with disabilities, visited North Korea a few years ago. She was not extraordinarily enthused. Nevertheless, this happened. Some of the detention facilities in the border areas with China have been closed down. Unfortunately, many of them have been relocated inland. This tells one that the regime of North Korea does know that the international community cares. After the UN COI report of February 2014, North Korea dispatched its foreign minister to the UN to speak at the UN in New York City for the first time in 15 years. So the North Korean regime is a terrible human rights violator, but it does take notice, and these efforts must continue.
Exactly. And well, Director Scarlatoiu, now some people see human rights as a domestic issue, and they believe that, especially when it comes to initiating dialogue with North Korea, they believe that denuclearization or peace needs to come first as an agenda. There are also concerns that raising human rights may only drive the North away, particularly when they're trying to talk about denuclearization. And well, do you think that the United States and North Korea can address human rights issues at the same time? Like, does it always have to be one or the other?
Absolutely. They can be addressed at the same time. We have been addressing only the very important, very difficult political, security, military issues, nukes and missiles, North Korean provocations, for almost 30 years now. Human rights has always been sacrificed on the altar of very important political security issues. Where did that take us? I would argue that perhaps it's time for a new approach that actually factors in North Korean human rights. We saw the very important action at the UN by a group of like-minded states after the UN Commission of Inquiry. And here I'm talking the United States, South Korea, Japan, the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, and others that came up with relevant and important measures on North Korean human rights. So I will argue in favor of including human rights in the issues addressed with North Korea. This is not simply a domestic issue. In today's day and age, in the year 2022, despots cannot just oppress and exploit their people with impunity in order to join the international community in the 21st century. And we surely hope that the DPRK, North Korea, will do that. They must do away with their political prison camp system. First, they must allow access to the UN, to the UN Special Rapporteur, to the International Committee of the Red Cross, why not to NGOs. They must proceed with dismantling these facilities. They simply do not belong on the Korean Peninsula. They do not belong in the 21st century.
And of course, Washington has countless foreign policy priorities. Right now, it might be Ukraine or China. But back when your organization started in 2001, of course, President George Bush was consumed with Middle Eastern affairs, and he began his war on terror. But throughout the years and throughout these different administrations, how did you manage to keep North Korea's human rights situation on the agenda for these different US administrations?
I work with an extraordinary group of board members and HRNK staff members. The first condition is dedication to what we do and belief in what we do. And our fundamental belief is that the 25 million people of North Korea need access to opportunity, need the opportunity to make their lives and the lives of their families better. It's important to be thorough. It's important to document. It's important to thoroughly research, document, and report on the North Korean human rights situation. Since access is limited, it's important to maximize our capitalizing on sources inside the country. It's important to work with North Korean escapees, and it is important to work in particular with satellite imagery analysis when it comes to documenting and reporting on North Korea's vast system of political imprisonment. It's very important to provide this type of information and analysis to decision makers. We do not lobby, we simply provide the necessary information in order to make relevant decisions. We provide this type of information to UN agencies, UN member states, the European Union. The other day, I met with a European parliamentarian from the Netherlands. Of course, we provide this kind of analysis and information to members of our US Congress as well.
Well, many are hoping for internal grassroots change in North Korea as well, but you said that there is a low degree of social cohesion within the North due to the very oppressive social climate that was generated by very harsh surveillance and punishment by the state. What then is the best way to empower North Korean people living under the regime?
That is absolutely correct. They have suffered from this never-ending cycle of coercion, control, surveillance, and punishment. The best we can do is to empower the people of North Korea. The best way to empower the people of North Korea is to send in information from the outside world. Tell them three fundamental stories. They're denied access to these three fundamental stories. The truth about the outside world, in particular free, democratic, prosperous South Korea. The truth about their own human rights situation, and also the truth about the corruption of their leadership. Let's say it in particular, the corruption of the inner core of the Kim family and other senior apparatchiks who have been maintaining the regime in power. And when I say empowerment, I do not imply any type of violent change. When I say that, I simply mean empowerment is the only way toward progress. All Koreans deserve much better. All Koreans really need to think of unification under a free, democratic, prosperous Republic of Korea. That dream should never be abandoned.
And Director, what do you hope to see from Seoul in order to advance human rights in North Korea?
We need to see South Korea retake the high ground it once held at the United Nations on North Korean human rights. We want to see South Korea participating and co-signing resolutions on human rights in North Korea that are passed in the General Assembly, at the UN Human Rights Council. We want the South Korean government to become once again a very active and dynamic promoter of human rights in the DPRK. We need to give a voice to North Korean escapees. They have been having a very hard time for a few years now. Their organizations have been defunded. Their voice is no longer heard as much as it used to be. Most importantly, going back to information, we need to empower the people of North Korea through information. There's only a limited number of vehicles that we have available. Radio waves, mobile media storage devices such as micro SD cards. Why not those leaflet balloons that have created such a controversy in South Korea? By removing one of these vehicles, this will have a negative impact on the availability of information in North Korea.
And Director, you founded the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea in 2001, and since then you've been, of course before then too, you've been working tirelessly to bring the situation to the world's attention and really mobilise efforts for change. Well, what first really drew you to North Korean human rights, and how were you able to keep going over the years despite the difficulties and, I imagine, the sort of darkness and the pressure that you must have faced as well?
The committee was indeed established 21 years ago by a group of most distinguished U.S. scholars, former government officials, and others with a deep concern for North Korean human rights, who realized that there was a gap in research and investigation on North Korean human rights. As far as I'm concerned, this is a very personal matter. I'm a naturalized American now. I was born and raised in communist Romania. I grew up on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I was a student, a freshman majoring in English language and literature at Bucharest University when the Ceausescu regime fell. I was right in the midst of it. Remember, Ceausescu and Kim Il-sung were really good friends, and Ceausescu was trying to turn Romania into the North Korea of Eastern Europe after he first visited Pyongyang in 1971. So it's a very personal issue. I, of course, went to South Korea as the first Romanian ever to end up there on a South Korean government scholarship. Very personal issue, having been born and raised in the one country most similar to North Korea and Eastern Europe, and having spent 1 decade on a divided Korean peninsula, having studied, worked, and lived in South Korea, there is a huge debt of gratitude I owe to the people of South Korea. After all, I studied there on a South Korean government scholarship. And there's also a sense of mission that I have lived under a similar system. And those 25 million people of North Korea do deserve much better. They do deserve access to a decent life governed by human rights and governed by access to opportunity. Very personal mission, let me put it this way.
And while you recently celebrated your 20-year milestone, and hopefully in the next 20 years, we will see you, I'm sure we'll see you continue to be at the forefront of human rights in all of Korea. And well, I'm afraid we're out of time today, so this is where we must leave it. That was Greg Scarlatoiu, Executive Director of HRNK. Thank you so much for your time.
A great pleasure. Thank you very much.